All right, guys. As a review, make sure that you're taking notes in your written notebooks. Make sure your phones are away, just like if you were in class. Don't forget you can pause and rewind when necessary. And you're going to make notes of questions that you have for me. Don't forget now that you can send me those questions either via Canvas or during our next class time. If you're doing this e-learning, that means that our test is coming up next rotation, so you're going to want to go ahead and just send me your questions via Canvas. All right, so we're diving in here to population biology in a little bit more detail. We've looked at population dynamics already, but for example, we've got this population of penguins here. So as we're taking a look at population dynamics of something like this, we're going to be looking at, how does this population change over time? How does this population react to changes around it? How does this population react to things like birth and death rates, and so on. All right, so as we go forward now, I want to take a look at the overall levels of complexity from the most simple, or the simplest, to the most complex. So starting with an atom at the bottom, which you learned in physical science is the smallest unit to exhibit a chemical property, we're going to work up all the way to a biosphere. So right now I'd like you to answer the question, as we go from atom to biosphere, we will be moving from less complex to more complex, or increasing with complexity. So I want you to answer the question, as we increase with complexity, what's going to happen to energy? Is it going to be gained or lost? And as we move from atom, we're going to go to a molecule, right? A molecule is just basically two or more atoms. So an example of an atom might be a sodium atom or a sodium ion, Na+. And then an example of a molecule would be like sodium and chlorine, making sodium chloride or table salt. So this right here is kind of where we break off the physical world and we head into the biological world, right? So the building block or the basic unit of life is what? I'm going to go ahead and ask you that question now. All right, so it is, of course, the cell, which is the fundamental unit of life. Then when we get a bunch of cells together, right, we can make, from there, we're going to have tissue, and then we're going to have organs and organ systems, all the way to an organism, which is an overall individual living being, and then into what we're talking about today, which is a population. Okay, remember, a population is going to be individuals of the same species living and reproducing in a particular place, just like a penguin. And one of the important pieces to that is that they are able to reproduce fertile offspring. All right, so that is a population. From a population, we get multiple populations together. We're going to have a community, which is a group of interacting populations. There's our buzzword, of course, interaction. And it's those interactions we're going to be talking about today, how populations interact within themselves and how populations interact with other populations. Next, we have an ecosystem, which is a group of communities interacting with their abiotic factors and with energy, and then the broadest or the largest would be the biosphere, where life is found, including air, water, and soil. As we said at the beginning, as complexity increases, we actually are going to be losing energy, right? Because we're passing on energy from one organism to the next. All right, so for a population, once again, we're talking about a group of organisms of the same species. So the keys there is that they are the same species, they're interacting, and they're able to reproduce. They're able to produce offspring that are going to be fertile. All right, our different components now to populations that we're going to be analyzing. The first component is the geographic distribution of these organisms, all right, meaning It's the range of the population. Basically just where a population lives, and I even have your units there. So, for example, if it was an ocean population, we could cast out a net that would have a certain size to it, and we'd be able to pull in all of the organisms that are in that area and analyze them. So again, a population biologist, one of the first things they're going to be studying about a population is going to be the geographic distribution of that population. The next factor that a population biologist is going to study is going to be the density of the population. All right, so again, this is the number of individuals per unit area. We've gone ahead and identified what our unit area usually is going to be up here. The formula for this is simply the number of individuals per unit area. Our next factor we're going to be looking at is going to be dispersion. So basically this is how individuals are going to be spread out. So we're looking at, first of all, the geographic distribution, right, which is where they're located, why they're located there. If it's a marine ecosystem, then we might be looking at how those clownfish are distributed via the sea anemones, and then we'd be taking a look at that relationship between the sea anemone and the clownfish. We might be looking at how densely populated the clownfish population is in the coral reef, and then we could look at how the clownfish are dispersed. There's going to be 3 different ways that we're going to look at these dispersion patterns. The first is going to be what we call clumped, and there could be a number of reasons why these organisms are clumped in these different patterns. For example, if we were to look at a population of giraffes, if each individual dot here represents one giraffe, there might be a clump of trees at each one of these areas that the giraffes are attracted to because perhaps they feed on the leaves of those trees. If it's the clownfish example, there just might be pockets of sea anemones in these different areas, and then that's why the clownfish are dispersed in this pattern. The next pattern is going to be even. We see things like pelicans, for example, that fly in a straight line, where they have the stronger pelicans towards the front, and then the younger pelicans are kind of intermingled. All right, that's an example of an even pattern. And then over here we have a random pattern, and that's one of the things that's really different between the physical sciences and the biological sciences, is that there's always a randomness to things. Sometimes we can explain it, sometimes we're unable to explain it. So far we've got geographic distribution, density, dispersion. These are all ways that we're going to be studying populations of organisms and their interactions with their biotic and abiotic factors around them. The fourth one is the growth rate, and this is important. This is going to be one that we're going to spend a little more time on, because this is going to be identifying how fast a population grows. And this is when we're going to be looking at organisms moving into a population or immigration. We're going to be looking at how many births a population is going to have. So we've got immigration plus birth rates, or number of births, and we're going to subtract that from how many organisms are leaving the population, or immigration, and we're going to add that then to deaths. And we're going to be putting that over the total population. So we've got immigration plus births minus immigration plus deaths over the total population. That's going to give us our growth rate. All right, so as we take a look now at growth rates in a little bit more detail, we're going to be looking at 2 different types of curves. The first type of curve is what we call a J curve. It's shaped like a J. I want you to take a moment and think to yourself, if we have on the x-axis time and on the y-axis we have the number of individuals, is this a curve that we would consider to be realistic or logistical? Go ahead and answer that question now. So yes, this is going to be a curve that really is not logistical or realistic. Now, exponential growth does happen all the time, so you're going to see things like this, a trend like this, where we have an increase, right? That's naturally going to happen. The thing is it's going to eventually level off, all right? The conditions for exponential growth would be plenty of resources and really a lack of predators or disease. But in a normal ecosystem, in a realistic or a logistical ecosystem, there's going to be predators. There's going to be some disease. There's going to be limited supply of space and food. There are examples, though, in the biological world where we see exponential growth that continues and continues out of control, and it tends to cause a problem. For example, E. coli is a great example. It's a bacteria. E. coli can double every 20 minutes. All right? So E. coli doubles every 20 minutes. That means within 24 hours, you can imagine there's going to be a lot of E. coli. All right? So that's an example. If the space and the resources are there, okay, then we will see uncontrolled exponential growth. So the question is the J-curve sustainable? And obviously the answer to that question is no, it is not, because resources will become scarce over time. All right, so let's just go and get some reasons why this is not sustainable. So these reasons for why the J-curve is not sustainable is pretty simple, right? Resources become scarce. All right, so and the resources can be considered space. They can be considered food, water, shelter, all those things. Waste will accumulate, and if it's not disposed of properly, can cause disease. Competition clearly is going to increase, right? If there's a certain amount of resources, the organisms are going to compete for those certain amount of resources, which is going to cause this eventual kind of slowing of the curve at some point. Growth simply will stagnate. It'll slow. But the important concept here is the idea of a carrying capacity. We are going to denote carrying capacity by the letter K. And a carrying capacity simply is the number of individuals the environment can support over a long period of time. And that is what's going to prevent this uncontrolled J-curve, is the carrying capacity. All right, so now we're going to take a look at limits on growth, or what we call limiting factors. All right, so a limiting factor is a factor that causes population growth to decrease. So go ahead and get that down. Again, it's going to cause the population growth to decline. So as we can see here, this is an example of a human population from 1800 to 1925, right? So a lot of time has passed here. We see exponential growth here at the beginning, which again is normal, but we start to see it level off. You can see that we have our carrying capacity, or our K, up here, and there's a little bit of an overshoot to start with, but then at that point there are going to be limiting factors that drive this growth curve down. Examples of those limiting factors again would be competition, predation, parasitism and disease, climate extremes, things like drought, perhaps natural disasters, and then of course human disturbances. So if it's an organism that relies on trees in a forest, and we go through and we cut down the trees, that's going to be a disturbance that's going to cause that population to decline. So make sure you have these growth factor, these limiting factors down. So next we're going to take a look at a more realistic curve, and that is the S curve, right? We have this early rapid exponential growth here at the beginning, and that's the kind of the beginning of the J curve right there, right? Then we see here that growth is going to begin to slow, and then eventually, as we get up towards the carrying capacity, that's what this dotted line is going to represent, we're going to see that growth approach zero. All right. So when the population is small, we're going to see that birth rates are actually going to be greater than death rates. All right. And then when the population is at the carrying capacity, of course, now the birth rates is equal to the death rate. And then lastly, when the population actually reaches the carrying capacity, we're going to see that birth rates are less than death rates. So there's going to be two types of limiting factors, two broad categories. The first category are density-dependent limiting factors, which are simply limiting factors that depend on the population size. So as the density of the population increases, we're going to see things like competition increase, predation is going to increase, parasitism, disease, a virus outbreak is going to be, it's going to have more of an impact on a densely populated ecosystem or community, right? And then shortages of resources. So density dependence is our first type of limiting factor that we're going to look at. So if we have density dependent, then clearly the next one is going to be density independent, and this is going to be something like a natural disaster, right? So this is a limiting factor that really is going to impact all populations in similar ways. So no matter how big the population is, it's going to be impacted the same. Examples of this would be unusual weather, natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, things like that, and of course human activities. If we add a dam to a river system, that's going to cause ecological impacts down the river, right? So these are our density independent factors. Last thing we're going to take a look at is how ecosystems change over time. So we have what is called ecological succession. The word succeed kind of does mean to change. So we're going to have two types. We're going to have primary succession and secondary succession. Let's take a look here at our primary succession. It's going to start with the pioneer stage. And you're going to want to get this kind of flow chart down in your notes. All right, that we start with a pioneer stage with bare rock, lichen, and moss. That's the first stage of succession. Now, this is primary succession because we're starting with bare rock. We're starting with a whole new ecosystem. So, for example, in this case, could be a new island formation from a volcano. We're going to have that bare rock, and then eventually we're going to have things that grow from there. That's the pioneer stage. All right, so again, our first part here, our pioneer stage moves into the intermediate stage. And this is pretty commonsensical, guys, so don't overthink it too much, but I do want you to understand that we've got this first stage here, which is our pioneer stage. Then we move into our second stage, which is our intermediate stage, where we have grass, shrubs, pines. We start to get into some of the larger plants after that, some of the rooted plants. And then lastly, our climax community, which is going to be full of our large trees. This is when the forest, at this point, basically is completely back to normal, or to normal for the first time if it's primary succession. The second form of succession is secondary succession. It's going to follow the same pattern. I just want to make a note that this is going to be caused originally, it's going to be caused originally by some type of natural disaster like a forest fire or something that levels the community, and then we're going to follow this same pattern of a pioneer species. So you can see instead of bare rock here, we have some soil that's left over from the fire, right, from the post-natural disaster, and you're going to see some of our lichen here, some moss, and then we have some flowers and some small shrubs that are going to grow, and then my intermediate species in the middle, and then my climax community, which is going to be our full-blown forest. So that wraps up our lesson there with succession. The last thing I'm going to have you do today is get these questions down and answer these questions. So at the end of your notes, remember you're going to be uploading a copy of your notes for this assignment, unless you are one of my face-to-face classes and you're just using this lesson as a review from the lesson that we did in class. The first question is, what factors affect population growth? The second question, what is exponential growth? Which organisms experience exponential growth? What is logistical growth? Which organisms experience logistical growth? Get those first three down. And then you're also going to get these three down. Number 4, how do biotic and abiotic factors affect carrying capacity? Number 5, how do density-dependent limiting factors affect carrying capacity? And number 6, how do density-dependent limiting factors affect carrying capacity? So you want to be able to answer those. You should be able to answer those 6 questions as a preparation for our ecology test, which is finally coming up here shortly.